Hi everyone. I hope week one has gone well for you. Please remember that if you've not had an exam yet, that's completely fine. You are more than welcome to wait until you have a test to go talk to your instructor about the exam. We might as well make this really useful for you. However, I do still want you to go to office hours because it's one of the most important things you can do with regards to improving your score in a class because talking to the professor is going to ultimately help you figure out how to improve your study habits and so forth. So I would highly encourage you to take a homework or something that hasn't gone quite as well as you would like and still go talk to them at least until you've had your first exam. So, before we can really understand how to build memories, we should probably talk about what they are. Now, whether you realize it or not, the average brain consists of between 80 to 100 million neurons. Okay, they all link to thousands of neurons, each leading to networks of communication. There are several areas of the brain that are important to learning. The first is called the amygdala. Now, this is a relatively new finding in neurobiology, but what people are realizing is that this helps us to retain memory. So it's an almond-shaped subcortical region in the temporal lobe, and it binds memories together and helps storage. Okay. Additionally, there are other parts of the memory or parts of the brain, I'm sorry, that are relatively important. The hippocampus, for example, which is in the basal medial part of the temporal lobe, allows the brain to process memory for context. And you can imagine how this would be incredibly important when it comes to learning new material. Personally, I'm a visual person, and so I like to actually see pictures. So when it comes to memory, and we're going to talk more about this later on, there's short-term memory, which is also called working memory. And this actually happens in the prefrontal cortex. So in your brain stores information for about 1 minute, and its capacity is limited to about 7 items. So this allows you to dial a phone number that someone just told you. Now, I don't know about all of you, but there have been days where this part of my brain just is not working. Hopefully you all don't go through the same thing. So this part of the brain also intervenes during reading and allows you to memorize the sentence you've just read, okay, so that the next one actually makes sense. So this is really useful. Now, long-term memory is processed in the hippocampus of the temporal lobe, and this is activated when you want to memorize something for a longer time. So this memory has unlimited content and duration capacity. It contains personal memories as well as facts and figures. Now, you may not realize this now, but aging actually does have a pretty big impact on your brain, and so what you can remember kind of changes later on, but we'll talk about that later on in today's lecture. Last but not least, we have skill memory. And so skill memory is processed in the cerebellum, which relays information to the basal ganglia. This stores automated learned memories like tying a shoe, playing an instrument, and riding a bike, and all sorts of other good stuff. So when I was younger and I was learning about science and neurons and so forth, I realized that it's actually a fascinating field for many different reasons. So if we actually look at a brain cell, this is what it looks like. Okay, so there's the nucleus, the axon, the cell body, there's the nodes of Ranvier, there's the Schwann cell, myelin sheath, and axon terminal where they happen to join with other memory cells. There is a YouTube video here that I embedded in this particular slide, and I will end up adding it to the announcements as well. So I'm a pretty big believer in using outside resources when they exist and when they're really good. And this kind of shows you how brain cells and neurons communicate, which is actually pretty awesome. One of the things I found to be most interesting to me is the fact that the way neurons fire or the way they function is based on sodium or salt channels, which to me is incredibly interesting. And so this is why your body likes to have consistent levels of salt. So your body likes to stay in what's called homeostasis, which means that if everything's going well, it's functioning the way it's supposed to, it wants to keep it that way. So I don't know if you've ever noticed if you happen to consume a high salt diet, your body will have you then start to retain water. And what it's doing is it's trying to sort of dilute all of the salt that you happen to have in your cells that your cells have recently taken up. I always found that really fascinating. And back many, many years ago, soda pop used to contain a whole lot of salt, but it contains a lot less of that these days. And this is part of the reason. So your body doesn't respond well if you've had too much salt, because then it starts to interfere with how your neurons fire and how your body basically functions. So if you ever happen to be curious someday about why you might be retaining water if you've eaten too much salt, then this is why. And it's so your body doesn't have any issues with functioning and all sorts of other important things that it's supposed to do. So I'd like you to take a couple minutes, and I would like you to click on that video. And again, if it causes a problem for you, I will include it in the announcements for this week. And once you've watched it, then I'd want you to just go ahead and think about it, and we will talk again on the next slide. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I thought it was really fascinating. So what I'd like to talk about next is basically what a memory is. Okay, and obviously it's pretty easy to see why this is important when it comes to learning, because what is learning, it's a memory. So what a memory is the reactivation of a specific group of neurons. Okay, so basically you start getting these connections between neurons, and the stronger the connections are, the stronger your memories are. Okay. So the term memory describes the persistent changes in the strengths of connections. These are called synapses, by the way, in between brain cells. So when you're trying to learn something, the reason you repeat it is you're trying to connect your neurons with one another. Okay, so this is what's actually helping you remember something, is yours trying to increase the connections between those neurons. So the more you revisit something and the stronger that you learn it, and the more that you have it, truly have it down, then you'll be able to discuss it on an exam or something along those lines. But what you're trying to do is again, strengthen those connections. That's so incredibly important. So we said this briefly earlier, but now I'd like to go into more depth. We know that there's memory, different types of memory, and memory actually takes many different forms. So when you store a memory, you're basically storing information. But what that information is and how long we keep it determines what type of memory it is. So the biggest categories of memory are short-term memory, this is otherwise known as working memory, and long-term memory. This is based on the amount of time a memory is stored. Both can weaken due to age, by the way. Yay! Things for you all to get excited about later in life. But there are a variety of other reasons and clinical conditions that it can affect memory as well, and we'll talk about those later. So the two major categories of memory, let's focus on that first, long and short term. Long-term memory is our brain system for storing, managing, and retrieving information. Okay, so short term, when we get, again, we said this was working memory. It's the very short time that you keep something in mind before either dismissing it or transferring it to long-term memory. Okay, now whether you realize it or not, there are several different types of long-term memory. So they're more complex, and we store different types of information like procedures, life experiences, language, and so forth with separate memory systems. So explicit memory, which is on the diagram, is also known as declarative memory, and this is a type of long-term memory that requires conscious thought. It's what most people have in mind when they think of a memory. Okay? There's also implicit memory, and this is a major form of a long-term memory that does not require conscious thought. It allows you to do things basically by rote memorization. Okay? There's also autobiographical memory. Most of us have one part in our life that we remember better than others, so I've forgotten most of my life. Not really, I'm just kidding. And then researchers have come to believe that sleep, by the way, helps our brains consolidate what we learn and remember. And so those of you that are not getting enough sleep and then having a bad exam, guys, this is why, okay? And we're going to talk more about this later on in the term, but I cannot overemphasize how important sleep is to retaining information and then being able to discuss it on an exam. So make sure you get enough sleep the night before an exam, all right? Okay, moving right along. So you guys might be asking yourself, how does all of this relate to learning? Well, believe it or not, it's incredibly important. To remember something, which is ultimately useful and very much required to learn something, basically what's going on is you're reactivating your neurons, okay? And so when you're studying and you're trying to learn something, you form connections between these neurons. And when you forget, what's going on is you're losing those connections. So this is why when you're studying, repetition is key, because in order to truly learn it, you have to build those strong bonds in between those neurons. Okay, So when you have these connections that are consistently being fired, okay, and they're going through an action potential, you're making much stronger links and much stronger synapses, and ultimately this is what allows you to remember something. So unless you have a photographic memory, which I had cousins who have a photographic memory, and we're not going anywhere near that because most of us don't, and I certainly don't. Um, the key to remember something is by repeating it and being able to build those strong bonds in between those neurons so they can fire and you can get that action potential moving in between neuron A and neuron B here, for example. So this is what's allowing you to remember that vital information that you're wanting to be able to use and recall during an exam. So the good news is that neurons are actually created all the time in our life in the hippocampus. And so this is called neurogenesis. Now, when you're very young, and for example, you're still developing as a fetus, you are, building a lot of those neurons. But this continues even later on in life and ultimately throughout our lifespan. So we may not get as many as we like, but your body is creating new neurons all the time. So, what I think is particularly fascinating is that your brain differs in how it develops neural pathways with age. Okay, for example, let's say you're 5 years old and you remember a house. Well, let's say you draw a house, and that's based on what you remember. It's because you don't have a lot of experience yet. And so you take a very direct path in the neurons and your memory. But let's say you're 50 years old, okay? And so you gain a lot of experience. You've got a lot of synaptic plasticity there where you can have different routes. And this is just part of experience and as your brain develops with time and you're trying to remember a house, well, of course, you're going to remember your own house with all of the details with it. And because of that, you're going to have a much more complicated neural pathway. I mean, seriously, isn't that cool to know? So let's talk about memory encoding. So encoding is a very important first step and what you need to first create a new memory. So what this does is it allows the perceived item to be converted into a construct that can then be stored within the brain. The idea is that you then recall this later from either short-term or long-term memory. So encoding is basically the beginning of perception through the senses. So think about perception. We don't pay attention to everything that goes on around us all of the time because if we did, then our brains would just be constantly overloaded. So when you're first forming a memory, your attention goes to something, which, if you're curious, is regulated by your thalamus and frontal lobe. And so this memorable event causes the neurons to fire more frequently. This makes the experience more intense and increases the likelihood that you're going to store this as a memory. Okay? Emotion tends to increase attention, and that should actually make sense to you. And the emotional element of an event is processed in an unconscious pathway, which leads to amygdala. Okay? Only then do you get the crucial sensations that allow this event to be processed. Hopefully, this all makes sense. The perceived sensations are then decoded in the different sensory areas of the cortex, and then they are combined in your hippocampus into a single experience. So basically, you have your brain that's pulling from all these different areas because your attention is focused and you're going to make this memory. Okay. The hippocampus is then responsible for analyzing these inputs, decides if it will be committed to long-term memory, and this is sort of a storing center. Okay, so all these new sensations are compared and associated with previous recorded ones. So think about when you smell chocolate chip cookies. If you had a grandma that did a lot of baking or a lot of cooking, then that might actually take you back to spending time with her and having her cook. Okay, and so that's going to trigger those memories. So the whole idea is that the key role of the hippocampus plays in memory encoding has been highlighted by different examples. Sadly, a lot of this happens to people who've had damaged hippocampuses. And that's a way we've learned a lot about the brain is based on people who've had some sort of damage to their brain or something's not functioning quite right. That's when we realize what the different parts do. But we can use that information to our benefit then to help other people. And so the hippocampus, if you're curious, is also one of the first areas of the brain where new neurons can grow. So the exact mechanism of how encoding happens really isn't understood. So they know that you have to form the short-term memory from some sort of ultra-short sensory memory, which then has to have a conversion to long-term memory by some sort of process called consolidation. And so this begins with creating a memory trace in response to some external stimuli. So think of smelling those chocolate chip cookies. And then this hypothetical change will impact the neurons of the brain. And but this is where sort of the knowledge and science leaves off, and where a lot more research needs to be done. So let's talk about how we ultimately convert things from short-term memory to long-term memory. So as we've said, the creation of memory begins with its perception. So your brain has to kind of cue in and pay attention to something. Okay. Then you've got that brief sensory stage that lasts a fraction of a second, smelling those cookies. All right. It's your sensory memory that allows the perception, like visual pattern, sound, or touch, to linger even once the situation is over. So after that first flicker, the sensation is stored in your short-term memory. Now remember, we said this before, it has fairly limited capacity. It can hold about 7 items for no more than 20 or 30 seconds at a time. My memory, less. You might be able to increase the capacity somewhat by using various memory strategies. For example, if you have a 10-digit phone number such as 800-584-0392, you might not be able to remember that, but dividing it into chunks like 3 numbers, and 4 numbers might actually stay in your memory long enough for you to dial the telephone. By repeating the number to yourself, you can also help that short memory kind of stick, okay? But then ultimately, what you're trying to do when you're learning is to transfer the material from the short-term memory into long-term memory. Okay? The more information is repeated or used, the more likely it is going to end up in your long-term memory or be retained. So, this is why studying helps people perform better on tests. All right? Now, unlike sensory and short-term memory, which is limited and decay rapidly, long-term memory can store unlimited amounts of information indefinitely, although I can tell you some days it doesn't always seem like that. So, people tend to easily store more material on subjects they already know something about. This is crucial, by the way, for learning. The information has more meaning to you and then can be connected to information that you've already stored in long term. So, someone who has an average memory might be able to remember more depth of information on one subject because they already have a lot of experience with it. Okay? Ultimately, subjects like biology and math and all that other good stuff, what you want to do is take that information that you're trying to learn and link it back to things you already know because you're much more likely to remember it. So put it in context, twist it around, find ways to link it to parts of your brain that are already in that long-term memory. Okay? Most people think of long-term memory when they think of memory itself, but most experts believe that information must first pass through sensory and short-term memory before it can be stored as a long-term memory. To learn how information makes its way out of long-term memory, we're going to have to explore memories are recalled, and then what happens when a memory cannot be retrieved. This is also known as forgetting. So we'll definitely chat about this later on in lecture today. So when you want to remember something, for example, let's say that you're learning information in a new subject, you have to retrieve the information on an unconscious level, and then you have to bring it to your conscious mind at will. While most people think they have either a bad or good memory, in fact, most people are fairly good at remembering some types of things and maybe not so good at remembering others. So if you do have trouble remembering something, assuming you don't have some sort of physical issue, it's usually not the fault of your entire memory system, but some sort of component that's not efficient, and this is a part of your memory system. So let's think through an example. Think about how you remember where you put your eyeglasses if you wear eyeglasses, or your cell phone if you happen to put that down. When you go to bed at night, you have to register where you're placing your eyeglasses or your cell phone. So basically you have to pay attention while you set them on the bedside table. You have to be aware of where you're putting them or you won't be able to remember the location the following morning. Okay, so next this information is retained, ready to be retrieved at a later date. If the system is working properly, when you wake up in the morning, you remember exactly where you left your eyeglasses or your cell phone. So your brain has to sort of key in order to remember that. So think about that as you're learning information. You want to try to make sure that you're paying attention and not just passively reading something, because if you do, you're going to completely forget it, within a day or so. So let's talk about forgetting. This is something, by the way, that happens to me often. So maybe you all can sympathize with me. If you've ever forgotten where something is, okay, or forgotten a piece of information, one of several things could have happened. You might not have registered clearly where you put those eyeglasses or that cell phone down to begin with. You might not have retained what you registered. You might not be able to retrieve the memory accurately. Okay, so if you want to stop forgetting where you put your cell phone, you'll have to work on making sure that all three stages of the remembering process are working properly. Can I tell you how many times my husband has lost his wallet or lost his keys just because he's not paying attention? We won't discuss how many times I've lost mine. So if you've forgotten something, it might be because you didn't encode it very effectively. Remember, we talked about encoding a couple slides ago. You were distracted while encoding, okay, or you were having trouble retrieving the information. If you've forgotten where you put your cell phone or eyeglasses, you may not have really forgotten at all. The location may have never gotten to your memory in the first place. So, for example, you probably will say you know what a $5 bill looks like, but most times you've seen one. You've not actually encoded it in its appearance. So if you tried to describe it, you probably couldn't because it's not actually linked into that part of I really couldn't describe it other than the fact it has a 5 on it. So all of that is part of a memory and is something you should think about as you're trying to learn new information. So let's talk about distractions. And so distractions that occur while you're trying to remember something can really get in the way of trying to encode your memories. So if you're trying to read a business report in the middle of a busy airport, you might think you're remembering what you're reading, but you might really not have effectively saved it into your memory. Additionally, you might forget because you're simply having trouble retrieving the memory. So if you've ever tried to remember something one time and couldn't, but then later you remember that same item, it could be there was a mismatch between retrieval cues and the encoding of the information that you were searching for. By the way, as we get older, memory problems tend to increase. Yay! And we're going to chat in the next couple of slides how aging can actually impact your memory. So let's talk about aging and memory. So, not to disturb all of you, but this is something everybody's got to deal with at one time or another. Unfortunately, what starts to happen is the assembly process of memory starts to break down, and this begins in our 20s and tends to get worse as we reach our 50s. Oh, goody. This is age-dependent loss of function, and it appears in many animals, and it begins with the onset of sexual maturity. So your brain doesn't change its overall structure or grow whole new batches of nerve cells. Remember, it's the connections between these cells that change as you learn. So your synapses either get reinforced and our cells make stronger connections with each other, or what happens is these synapses begin to falter, and this definitely impacts how easily you can retrieve memories. Okay, so researchers have many theories about what's behind this deterioration. Most suspect that aging causes major cell loss in a tiny region of the front of the brain. And what has happening is we're not getting enough of acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is vital to learning and memory. In addition to this, some parts of the brain that are essential to memory are highly vulnerable to aging. The hippocampus, remember we mentioned this earlier, loses 5% of its nerve cells with each passing decade. We're not going to say how much percentage I've lost. So basically, for a total loss of 20% by the time you reach your 80s. So the brain itself, by the way, shrinks and becomes less efficient as you age. So now remember, other things can happen to your brain to speed up this decline. You might have some unhealthy genes or been exposed to poisons, maybe, smoking or drinking too much. Not that I ever did that when I was in college. I can't even get that out with a straight face. Anyway, all of these things, by the way, do actually speed up memory decline. So this is definitely something to think about as we're trying to build those synapses, not get rid of them. Now, as sad as that previous slide was, there's actually some good news out there. So studies have actually shown that many of the memory problems experienced by older people can be lessened or even reversed. Studies of nursing home populations show that patients were able to make significant improvements in memory if they're given rewards and challenges. Physical exercise and mental stimulation also really improve mental function. I took up jogging this year. The fact I have to keep jogging from now on just makes me sad. But if we want to lessen the impacts, this is part of it, guys. Evidence from animal studies also suggests that stimulating the brain can stop cells from shrinking and even increase brain size in some cases. Studies show that rats living in enriched environments with lots of toys and challenges have larger outer brains with larger, healthier brain cells. Animals given lots of mental exercise have more dendrites. This allows cells to communicate. Research has shown that in our later years, a stimulating environment encourages the growth of these dendrites, okay? A dull environment, by the way, impedes it. The important point to remember is that as you age, you may not learn to remember as quickly as you do in school, but you'll likely learn to remember just as well. In many cases, an older person's brain may be less effective, not because of a structural or organic problem, but simply as a result of lack of use. So what does this mean? The brain is like every other muscle in our body. You've got to use it, otherwise you tend to lose it. So having that mental stimulation as you get older is crucial to keeping good memory. If you guys find this topic interesting, there's a lot of good Coursera classes out there, and that's where I happened to borrow some of this information for this particular class. And so send me an email, and I'll be more than happy to send you guys the link. And remember, Coursera, you can take these classes for free, and the information is actually pretty cool. And so I've even learned things, for example, like the term chunking. Okay, so chunking is a term that refers to the process of taking individual pieces of information, otherwise known as chunks, and you group them together into larger units. So what does this mean? This is the connections and the synapses of the neurons, by the way. Okay, so all those synapses and links, this is what a chunk is. The idea is by grouping each piece into a large whole, you can improve the amount of information you can remember. So ultimately, as you're learning this information, you're starting out with little different bits, okay? But as you link it back to things you already know, and then as you link things together, this allows you to remember more. So hint, hint, as you're studying and you're preparing for an exam, the more you can link things to stuff you already know, or the more you can, link things together to have those bigger chunks with those stronger networks, the more likely you are to remember them. So let's take this to actually studying for class, okay, and studying for those exams. So the next time you're trying to remember items from a list, okay, you can actually use chunking. What you do is you start by forming smaller groups. So let's say you're working with a list of vocabulary words, for example. Create small word groups of words that are similar or related to one another. If you're trying to remember a shopping list, break it down into smaller groups based on whether the items are vegetables, fruits, dairies, or grains. Okay, so chunking can be used as an everyday memory enhancer. Researchers have also found you can improve your ability to effectively chunk information. So one participant who was involved in a memory experiment challenged himself to improve the number of items he could remember. He was initially only able to remember 7, but he increased it to 80 over time just in the course of 20 months. So what this means is you can get better at chunking and linking that information. Remember that when it comes time to studying for an exam. Okay, so the student described in the above experiment devoted an hour a day, 4 days a week for 2 years to achieve it. So you might not be able to devote such intense concentration, but you should be able to, because remember that you're going to use this technique as you're trying to learn information for exams. So you can definitely improve and make your brain's neural tendencies to look for patterns and be able to group information together so you can remember things better and better with time. So as we put this information to use, I would like you to practice this, okay? So challenge yourself to remember lists of things, whether it's a grocery list, vocabulary words, or material for an exam. Hint. So as you become better at remembering larger chunks of information, I want you to continue to challenge yourself to remember even more. So you have to look for those connections. Create groupings, look for ways to relate terms to each other in meaningful ways. Okay, what do the items share in common? Group the items because they're maybe spelled with 4 letters, or they start with the same letter, or they have a similar purpose. You can then associate linking the groups to things from your memory. This also makes them more memorable. You might be more likely to remember that you need eggs, baking soda, or chocolate chips if you associate the items with cookies. Okay, then incorporate other memory strategies. So using mnemonics is a great way to remember units of information. So if you're going to the grocery store, you need bananas, eggs, and nectarines and tea. So create a word out of the first letters, for example, B-E-N-T. And I can tell you, as I was trying to remember things in early biology days, I did this all the time. Okay, this really does help you remember things. Once you remember the key word, you can better recall the items represented by each letter of the acronym. So this is not a cure-all for memory problems, but it can definitely help in your memory improvement. By practicing chunking methods regularly, incorporating this into your study habits, you're going to definitely be able to remember more and ultimately, hopefully, score higher on those exams. Okay, so just one last quick wrap up. Short-term memories can become long-term memories through the process of consolidation. This involves rehearsal and meaningful association. Okay, so unlike short-term memory, which relies on acoustic and visual cues, long-term memory encodes information semantically, which is based on meaning and association. There's also some evidence that long-term memory encodes by sound. For example, when we can't quite remember a word, but it's on the tip of our tongue, this is based on the sound of the word, not its meaning. Okay. From a physiological perspective, the establishment of long-term memory involves a process of changes in the structure of the neurons in the brain. This is long-term potential. So there's still a lot that's not really understood about the process, but whenever something is learned, circuits of neurons in the brain, these neural networks are created, altered, or strengthened. So keep strengthening those links. Okay. This involves the creation of new proteins within the body of neurons and then neurotransmitters, which will then link at the synapses to the receptors. Think of all of this as you're trying to have all this information go from short term to long term. Okay, so you have to have these connections in the visual cortex, auditory cortex, and associative regions of the cortex. Several studies have actually shown that episodic and semantic long-term memories can be better recalled when the same language is used for both. Okay, for example, bilingual people tend to recall more autobiographical details in their early life when they were in one language instead of having two different languages, which is just kind of an interesting side note. Okay, although short-term memory is supported by transient patterns and neural communication in the frontal, prefrontal, and parietal lobes of the brain, long-term memories are maintained by more stable and permanent changes in neural connections spread throughout the brain. The hippocampus, remember this is important, acts as a kind of temporary transit for those long-term memories, and it's not used itself to store information, but it consolidates. Okay, for the short term to the long term. And this is what we want to do when it comes to getting our information into that long-term memory. Okay, realize that forgetting occurs with long-term memory when those connections among the neurons become weakened or lost. And this is what starts to cause us issues as we're trying to retain this information. Okay, everyone, I hope you found this lecture to be helpful. It's something that I do want you to keep in mind as you're going through and trying to learn new information. What I would like you to actually do for next week's assignment is to practice chunking, okay? And so I'd like you to do this by taking a list and either using an acronym or something along those lines that would help you to remember it, and I want you to keep building, okay? And then what I want you to do is to keep building these networks of these chunks of information until you can remember, a good amount, because ultimately this is going to help you when it comes time to recalling information for your exam. So what I'd like you to turn in is a list of information that you have worked on remembering, okay, or memorizing, and what sort of tips and hints that you've used to be able to remember it. Okay, so just give me a description or the list of what you're trying to remember, and then tell me what tools and what tricks and tips and so forth you use to actually remember it. And so you're welcome to actually turn this in online. I'm going to create an assignment for it tonight. And then please also don't forget, we will have another discussion this week. And so the discussion is going to be pretty cool. It's going to be a video that's going to discuss the idea of mind mapping. And so as we're creating all of these links, mind mapping, if you've never heard of the term before, is just sort of a way to map out how you think about things. And so hopefully that will be useful to you as well. So remember, I'll be in my office on Wednesday if you need to come see me. You are always welcome to send me an email if you need anything. I wish you a wonderful week, and I'm hoping all of this is useful to you. I'll talk to you soon.